Okay, well, here we are. That spooky noise, I guess, is announcing the start of the class. So where were we? We were talking about the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, which we have at this point totally covered. So I would just like to take a minute to talk about the kind of question you might see on aggregate supply, aggregate demand. So here is a multiple choice question taken from an old exam. Starting from long run equilibrium, if G goes up, what happens? Okay. And we're given a bunch of stuff. Output inflation will go up permanently. Output inflation will go up temporarily, but then go back down. Output inflation will go up, but then output will go back down, but inflation will stay there. Output inflation will go up, but then output will go back down, but inflation will go even higher. Output will go up, and inflation will go down temporarily, but then they will both return to their original levels. So you get a question like this. Since we're coming up on exam time, right? You get a question like this, what the heck are you supposed to do with this? First of all, it makes me dizzy even reading the answers. So how are you supposed to approach a question like this? So the first thing you're supposed to do is identify what the question is about. Is it sort of a theory question? Or is it a calculate GDP? Or is it kind of a vague understanding question? Vague. Like, do you understand stuff? Or is it trying to get you to use a theory? Is it trying to get you to understand what GDP is? What's it on about? And this is clearly a theory question. It's asking you a question about an economic theory. How do I know that? Well, it's asking us for a prediction, right? Well, the question doesn't really say that, but all the answers are clearly prediction sort of answers. So they're trying to predict what happens in the future, and that's what theory is about, right? It's about, one of the things that theory is about. Let's get a simplified version of the world so that we can understand that world and then possibly make predictions about what's going to happen, right? Use it for policy. So it's clearly a theory question, and so you're good there, you know, now that's a theory question. And now you have to figure out what theory is it on about. Okay. Well, we haven't had too many theories, right? So you should be able to narrow it down by a process of elimination. We've got the Keynesian cross diagram theory, right? And then we've got money supply, money demand, which is sort of a separate sort of theory. We'll bring them together next year, but it's a separate sort of theory. And we've got aggregate supply, aggregate demand. We've got three theories, right? And so we have to figure out what the heck is Ivan on about? What theory is he dreaming up today? Figure that out, right? So looking at it, it doesn't give us too much clue in the question, but it is a long run equilibrium, right? So there's a long run, and then there's all this stuff. Every single question has issues about what happens now, what happens later, what's the process of going between the two. Right, so there's definitely a notion of time in the question and in the answers. Right? And we only have one model so far that has any kind of notion of time in it. Right? We have the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model where there's a short run aggregate supply and a long run equilibrium, aggregate supply, and there's the movement between those two. We talked about the Keynesian cross diagram. That was completely a short run model. That was prices are fixed. This model applies as long as prices are fixed. And then after that, I don't know, anything could happen because the model doesn't tell us. Right? It just says prices are fixed. This model applies while prices are fixed. So we couldn't say anything about the long run. It was totally a short run model. All this up temporarily and then back down, all that kind of stuff doesn't show up in the model anywhere. It's just a one-shot model with no kind of conception of the future. One of its flaws, right? So it's definitely not that one. We had the money supply, money demand model, which, first of all, doesn't have government spending in it, right? So there's nowhere really for government, for that question to sort of attach itself. Now you could, like if you wanted to push it, like try to combine it with some other model, but it's really pushing it, right? We'll do that next year, but we won't do that here. And so that's unlikely to be it. And again, it's a completely short-term model. You increase the money supply, money demand goes up, at a given level of prices, right? Prices are one of the things that would shift our money demand, which means if we're increasing the money supply, probably prices are going to change eventually, right? But we're holding them fixed. So it's, again, a very short-term model. There's no notion of the future. There's nothing like that. So this has to be a question about aggregate supply, aggregate demand, just by process of elimination. There are, of course, you probably guessed, there's other models in the world, other stories in the world about how the world works that would have a long term and a short term. But this would be an exam in this class, so only the stuff in this class would count. So all those other millions of ways that you could think about the same issues, neither here nor there. So the only thing it can be about in this class is aggregate supply, aggregate demand. Okay. So we've identified the model. Okay. And then we want to know, starting from long-run equilibrium, if G goes up, what happens? Now, what you are meant to do at this stage is take out a piece of paper, back to the exam, whatever, and draw out the graphs. Okay? I personally, after 30 years of doing this goofy stuff, after 30 years, I would take out a piece of paper and I would draw the graphs. Okay? That is how I would approach the question. I would not know the answer, but I would know how to find the answer. Okay? That's what you're meant to do. So in any theory question, you are meant to draw the graphs. You'll have lots of time. It's a 2-hour exam. There's only 30 questions. You got all the time in the world to draw the graphs. For all that is good, please draw the graphs. But you'll be better off. But let's suppose I didn't know the graphs, right? Because we're pretending like we're in an exam here. I don't know the graphs. I didn't study this bit. I should have, but I didn't, you know how it is. And so here I am, and I got to figure this stuff out, right? I studied for the first half of the class. I kind of flaked off the second half of the class. What can I do? Or, just exam pressure, I forgot. I forgot how to do the graphs. How far can we get just using common sense and what we do know? Right? So we didn't study this model, but we're going to try to eliminate as many wrong answers as we can. Okay. Output and inflation will go up permanently. Well, I did study the Keynesian cross diagram, right? And so I know that increasing government spending in that model, not this model, but that model increases output. Increasing government spending is an expansionary policy in general, right? So A seems plausible, right? B also seems plausible from that. This seems plausible, but this doesn't. Output will go up, inflation will go down, okay. Okay, so all that seems plausible. Okay, I've eliminated nothing based on this. Well, what can you do? Lots of times you'll be able to, not this time. Okay, what else can I use? Yeah, I got nothing. Anyone see anything that they could use without actually knowing the model? This is a rare question. It is rare that a question is that way. Usually, if you calm down and say, look, I know government spending is expansionary policy, you can eliminate some stuff, right, just by this basic knowledge. The reason you can't here is because this model has a lot going on, and so it's relatively easy to write wrong answers. And so I didn't have to get grasping at straws to write wrong answers for this one. But usually, for most questions, I can think of 2 or 3 plausible answers, and then I don't know. And so I put down goofy stuff. And so if you're calm, you can eliminate the goofy stuff. So you have time. If you don't know, try to be calm. Okay. Always good advice, always hard to take. Well, hard to do in real life, right? But here we are. Okay, so we're meant to draw the graphs. And so what we're given is we are given, if I can make sure I'm still in frame for the folks at home. Why are they at home? Why aren't they out here? This is where all the cool kids are. What can you do? Okay. So we're meant to draw the graph. So what we have is we're starting from long-run equilibrium, and we are increasing government spending, and we're supposed to find that out. When in doubt, you should always start models from equilibrium, whatever the most equilibrium there is. because the real world isn't that way, right? The real world is messy. But the model isn't the real world. The model is a story about the real world, and it works best if we start it from equilibrium, unless told otherwise, which I don't think in my 30 years I've ever told anyone otherwise. I might have at some point. I can think of stories, but generally with models we want to start in equilibrium and then something changes. That would be the usual way to work a model. And here we're explicitly told. We're starting not only from equilibrium, but we're starting from long-run equilibrium. So let's add a page and draw the model in long-run equilibrium. So here we've got y, and here we've got, what do we have? We have inflation here. Inflation. So we've got long-run aggregate supply, which is y star. And we've got aggregate demand, and we're starting from long-run equilibrium. So long-run equilibrium is a point where people are guessing inflation correctly, right? And so if they get the inflation they get, if they get the inflation they expected, everything is going to be normal. We're going to have the normal level of output. So our long-run equilibrium starts out here. This is inflation expected, which is also actual inflation, say in period 1. And this is y in period 1, and we've got our short-run aggregate supply here. Okay. So that's our long-run equilibrium. That doesn't work. Green works better. Right? And then we're told that government spending goes up. Right? When government spending goes up, where is government spending in this? Well, it's a purchase. So initially, if nothing else changes and only government spending goes up, government spending doesn't produce anything necessarily, but so it's not part of supply, it's part of how much stuff are we buying, right? If they said government starts making stuff, that would be part of supply, but they didn't. They said they start buying stuff, right? And so that's going to be part of aggregate demand. And we know this because this is equal to C plus I plus G plus net exports, importantly, G, right? So G is our government spending. That's not good. Do we have power? Power. Okay, life is going to be good. It's not going to crash. We're all going to be fine. Don't panic. Everyone's panicking. Okay. It's only me who's panicking. Okay, so aggregate demand is going to go up. So at any given level of inflation, aggregate demand is going to be higher than before. So aggregate demand 2, it just shifts to the right. The whole curve shifts to the right because we just increased government spending, so whatever else is going on, we're going to have more spending than before. So at any particular level of inflation, we're going to have more spending than before. And so we get our new equilibrium here. So this will be y2, and this will be inflation 2. And in this model, that's what they mean. If we go back a page, when we say this temporarily, right? Or what initially happens will go up, but then, so whatever happens before. So what do we have so far? We've got output goes up and inflation goes up, right? So if we look at our answers, here, if we can, what do we got? From what we know so far, just doing the short run change, right, we have output inflation will go up permanently, plausible. Okay. Output inflation will go up temporarily, but then go back down. That's plausible. Output will go up. Output inflation will go up, but then output will go back down, but inflation will stay there. Output inflation will go up, but then output will go back down. Okay. Output will go up, and inflation will go down. This one we can eliminate at this stage. Right. That can't be true because this is saying inflation will go down, but our graph said inflation goes up. So we've eliminated E by doing the first bit. Also, if we've gotten this far, we clearly know something about this model, and we know that long-run aggregate supply is vertical, which means in the long run, we must be back at y star. So we have output going up just from the fact that we know about long-run aggregate supply as a thing. We can say that in the long run, output has got to go back down. Right? So we can eliminate A, because output can't go up permanently in this story. This is plausible. Inflation will go up, then output will go back down. Output inflation will go up, then output will go back down. Okay, so we're down to B, C, or D, right, at this stage. Okay. To eliminate these and to figure out which one we're at, we need to know a bit more about the model. We need to know what happens in the long run. So let's figure out what happens in the long run. Here we are. So we've got a situation where inflation, actual inflation, is higher than what people expected, right? And so they expected 5% inflation, they're getting 10% inflation. So in particular, workers that keep their jobs are getting screwed. They only got a 5% wage increase, but all of the prices went up by 10%. They can buy less stuff at the end of the year than they could at the beginning of the year. They're unhappy about this, right? And so they're going to ask for higher wage increases. And this will shift the short-run aggregate supply up as time goes by, and it's going to keep happening until we get to a point where what they're predicting is equal to what they're getting. So it's got to shift up eventually to here. Short-run aggregate supply, and we'll call it 2, just shifts up. Right. Now that could happen quickly in one round if we had rational expectations, or it could take time to slowly work its way there. But in either case, eventually it's going to get up there or get close to that. And so over time, we have output goes back down, Y2, and inflation goes up even more. Right. So in the long run, so initially, output and inflation go up, and then in the long run, output comes back down, but inflation goes even higher. Okay. Leaving well enough alone with other things, right? So in this case, we go back to our question. We can see what we've got. We've eliminated A and E. Output inflation will go up temporarily, but then go back down. That's not true. Inflation doesn't go back down. Inflation goes even higher. Output inflation will go up, but then output will go back down, but inflation will stay there. It's still higher, but it's not as good an answer as this one. Output inflation will go up, but then output will go back down, but inflation will go even higher. D is clearly better than C. If D didn't exist, this would be the best option, because what does stay there mean? But if you have an option between stay there and go up even higher is clearly better. So the correct answer is D. Okay. All right, so what do we get out of this? So first of all, you need to know how to play around with the model. We got one more chance to see how to play around with the model. For exam questions, be cool, you got lots of time. If it's a prediction sort of question, it's definitely a theory question. We've got 3 theories total. Figure out which theory it's on about. Draw the graphs. You will be good. Okay. Those of you who are coming to grips with studying for the graphs, and this is, I guess, everybody more or less, right? This is the time of the year. How should you study for the graphs? I would suggest this as a general approach. We've got 3 graphs total, right? Well, we have more graphs, but we have 3 models total, right? And so what you should do for each of them is get a stack of blank paper and take a paper, draw the axes, the y-axis, the x-axis. For God's sake, label them. Which one is y, which one is inflation, what's on them. Why, and then just with those axes on a blank piece of paper, those axes labeled, say why do we think those things might be related to each other, right? In this graph, we've got inflation and y. Why do we think that output and inflation should be related to each other? What's the connection between these things at all? Right? Think about that for a little bit. put that paper aside, get a brand new piece of paper, draw those axes again, and then put one of the lines on it. You can see we got 1, 2, 3 lines on this graph. Just draw one. What is the story for that line? Why, for example, did we draw this aggregate demand this way? What's our story behind why aggregate demand is drawn that way? Just looking at aggregate demand, nothing else. Right? Because all the time in these things, the lines represent different things. Right? What we have is a complicated system, the world, and everything in it is interconnected. The idea behind theory is that we want to take those things apart and represent each of those interconnected things as its own separate line, understand that one thing itself, and then bring them together to see the interconnected complicatedness on the graph. Right? That's the beauty of these graphs, is we take a series of stories, we put them together, and by doing so on the graph, we can see how they're interconnected. Right? But first, what you want to do is you want to understand each of those stories separately, then bring them together on the complicated graph. What students do is they look in the book and they say, here's the graph. Let me try to understand this thing as a whole. You really want to understand each line. Each line on the graph is a separate thing. Think about it separately. Draw your piece of paper, draw it on there. Why do we draw aggregate demand this way? Okay. And then, before you move on to any of the other lines, think about what would cause this thing to shift. What would cause us to move along this line? What would cause this line to move? Which directions would it move? Why? Okay. Once you have that line down, take that piece of paper, put it aside. Don't draw on the same paper. Take that paper, put it aside, and then draw another line for the next line on the graph until you've covered them all. Yeah?
Will there ever be a question where the long run average supply curve shifts?
There won't. And I have a slide about this in just a minute. We won't. It's in the book, Supply Shocks, where you shift shifting the short-run aggregate supply on its own and shifting the long-run aggregate supply. I find this model is confusing in that way. It's not wrong, all that's right, but any kind of question I might ask, it's not clear whether it's just the short run or the long run that gets shifted. Supply shocks are a big deal in the literature, but this is not a super useful model to learn them in. You can do it, you can play around with it, but I think it causes more confusion than it. So I won't have any of those. It'll be aggregate demand shifting. Yeah. Everybody thank her. That was very helpful. if you didn't notice, that was very useful for a student to know that. Yeah. And so then do the next line, and then do the next line. And once you've covered all the lines and you've thought about why they're drawn that way, why they're drawn at all, and what makes them shift, right? Or not, in our case, then put them together. Okay. None of them are very complicated, but there's enough going on in any one graph that you can get yourself dizzy, right? And that's why we have the graph, to undizzy ourselves, right? So think of them separately, then put them together. Okay. So what we've looked at is demand shocks, right? We were going along, everyone had their expectations of the future, and then they set their prices, they set their input prices, and then something happened unexpectedly. In this case, government spending went up unexpectedly. So here's just, apropos of nothing, what happens? Yeah, it's just what we did. You can take it or leave it. I think I was just doing that question there. Okay. The other thing that they have in the literature is supply shocks, as we were just talking about. This is a big deal. We are not doing them in this class. So, yeah. So don't. Like in the book, in any book, you'll see a lot on supply shocks because, again, they are a big deal in the literature, but we don't. Again, anything that happened to supply, like oil prices went up. That's a thing that happens, right? Oil prices sometimes go up. That makes it more expensive to do business. That will shift short-run aggregate supply. It'll typically, maybe, shift long-run aggregate supply. It's unclear in this model which one it's doing. It would really depend on what's going on with the oil shocks, how permanent they are, and all of that. But because there's two lines to shift, and it depends on how you interpret a question, it becomes confusing rather than illuminating. So we're just not doing it. But do be aware that these things are important. It's not like they're not. It's just that this is not a useful, it's a confusing tool to learn about them, so we're not doing it.